About 3 years ago, I did some programs here in this site. Well, actually, we stopped over at the firehouse over there because we had a big old, 65 passenger bus, and I didn't really feel like tooling it through here. But Nolensville was a stop on a special tour of the Stones River campaign that we did for the 150th anniversary of the campaign and the battle. It's been a couple of years, and I did want to kind of sort of, there was, when we did that tour, it was kind of nice to be able to tell the stories of what happened, on, the actual time frame of, the campaign and the approach of the Union Army from Nashville to Murfreesboro, right there on the ground, so people could at least kind of get a chance to see what, how the landscape and think about the events that shaped what will become the Battle of Stones River. Because oftentimes, when you read a book about a battle like ours or Gettysburg or something like that, there might be a couple of pages at the beginning of the book that kind of talks about how the armies sort of ended up getting towards each other, and then they just jump right into the battle proper. I mean, it's almost like they got magically transported to a battlefield, fight that battle, and then the next thing we'll hear from these two armies is down at Chickamauga and Chattanooga when they have their next big battle. Well, that's not the case. I mean, these soldiers, these guys, are involved in activities day to day, week to week, month to month, but particularly when it comes to a battle, at least a week before, probably sometimes even longer. And how those events play out will definitely shape how the larger battle that everybody focuses on ends up playing out. That is certainly true for the events of the Stones River campaign. So, since the first shots really of the Stones River campaign take place right in the vicinity of where we are right now, I figured this was a good place to stop, and it does give us some pretty good vistas to kind of get in our minds and see what's going on. So we're going to take just a short walk around the cemetery here. We're not going to kill ourselves or anything, but I want to kind of position you and have you looking different ways as we kind of roll through the story. So if y'all will just kind of come on down here with me. So let's talk a little bit about how this thing gets rolling. The Union Army, after the end of the Kentucky campaign, will switch commanders. Don Carlos Buell will be relieved of command, and General William S. Rosecrans will take his place. And the Union Army, which will be rechristened from the Army of the Ohio to its new name, the Army of the Cumberland, which actually does not officially happen until after the Battle of Stones River, but technically they're known as the 14th Army Corps Left, Right, and Center Wing, which is really not very sexy. So we just skip ahead a little bit to the Army of the Cumberland, because Rosecrans, basically, when he's in command, that's the beginning of the Army of the Cumberland era for the Union Army. The Army's about 43,000 men strong, and they will base themselves in Nashville, which has fallen in February of 1862 in Union hands, the first Confederate state capital of the fall, and will remain in the Union's hands through the duration of the war. General Braxton Bragg will take his Army of Tennessee out of Kentucky. At first, he will bring most of his soldiers and put them together at Chattanooga, but he will send John C. Breckinridge's division to the little town of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And then we'll decide to move the rest of his army in late October to that town for the winter season. Now, the reason Bragg has moved to Murfreesboro, if you look on your maps there, you can tell pretty easily why Murfreesboro would be an important town to hold here in Middle Tennessee. Because you see all those roads coming in there? It is sitting right smack in the dab in the center of almost every major road that runs through the Middle Tennessee region. The Nashville-Chattanooga Railroad, which is that dotted line running down from Nashville and heading on towards Chattanooga, runs right through Murfreesboro. So if you're thinking about stopping the advance of the Union Army in Nashville, as they head in whichever direction they might head, and everybody's pretty sure they're going to be heading for Chattanooga, which is indeed the next major goal of the Union Army, which is to seize the rail junction at Chattanooga. If you sit astride the Nashville-Chattanooga Railroad at the hub of a road network that lets you move in any direction you want to relatively quickly, you're pretty well positioned to do that. Plus, Bragg is feeding his army from food that has been grown here in the Middle Tennessee region in northern Alabama. If he stays in Chattanooga, which is is almost 100 miles away from Murfreesboro, while the Union Army sits in Nashville 30 miles away. Is he going to be able to get that food? It's not going to happen. So he's also essentially protecting and securing his supply base when he puts his army in at Murfreesboro. Now, he can't put all 38,000 men in Murfreesboro. Particularly, it's not the men that he's worried about, it's the horses. If you have, well, with an army of 38,000 men, you probably have close to 20-some thousand horses and mules for the various wagons and equipment that are being used. When they start browsing off the grass in and around Murfreesboro, how long do you think it lasts? Okay? Plus whatever fodder's been put up in the barns and stuff. You have got to spread your army out. You cannot stay all together in one place for several months, otherwise your transportation, your horses and mules will start dying because they won't have enough food to eat. So what Bragg will do when he gets to Murfreesboro, he'll actually send Hardee's Corps over to Triune, which is the little dot down here at the kind of the bottom left of the map over here. Okay. Polk's Corps he'll keep mostly in and around Murfreesboro, although he'll stretch them out to Reedyville and places up beyond as well. So he'll start stretching his army out. Now there's a bit of a danger to that, isn't there? Because if your 38,000 man army is spread out all over God's creation and the enemy comes out of Nashville and pounces on part of it, what's going to happen? You're going to be in big trouble because only part of your army is going to be tangling potentially with the entire Union Army when it comes out. And the Union Army is being pressed very hard to get out and make a movement. President Abraham Lincoln is pushing Rosecrans and all of his army commanders to engage in battle in December of 1862. In fact, December of 1862 will prove to be one of the busiest months in the entire Civil War, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? I mean, if you're moving an army by foot, horse, and mule, is the winter time the best time to be doing that? No, it's not, because what do we just have for the last 3 days around here? Rain. Now, we're lucky. We got paved roads. Most of the roads weren't even as good as this back then. They were just dirt roads, so they would turn into mud, muck, and mire. So, if you're, wanting to engage in a campaign, May would be much better. And trust me, after 18 years working at Stones River National Battlefield, don't I wish? Every year we get to experience what Mother Nature brings to us in December and offer these programs to you folks, telling these folks it's like tradition. January 2nd and 3rd, the days we'll be doing our big living history event. Guess what? It's going to get below freezing, just like the Battle of Stones River. So there you go. Now, Rosecrans, when he finally commits to move, one thing that Bragg spreading his army out has done is sort of confused Rosecrans. Rosecrans does not have a very viable or strong cavalry corps at the moment. He is working on making it better, and in fact it will get better as the days, months, and years roll on. But by the time the Stones River campaign begins, although Rosecrans, man for man, horse for horse, has about as many cavalry as the Confederates do, because the Confederates have sent 2/3 of their cavalry force away on raids. I see you've got Mr. Morgan's name on your thing. Where's John Hunt Morgan prior to the Stones River campaign?
Getting married.
Dunn got married, and we can talk about whether or not that was the end of his military career. But after he got married, 2-3 days later, where is he? He's on his way. He's up to Kentucky. He's heading for Kentucky with about 1/3 of the Confederate cavalry. Nathan Bedford Forrest. He's been in the news a lot lately. He's heading west towards the battle, eventually to fight the Battle of Parker's Crossroads on December 31st, 1862. He also has about 1/3 of the Confederate cavalry. So, the Confederate cavalry force has shrunk. The Union's is kind of growing and trying to learn how to actually operate properly as cavalry. But one of the things cavalry is supposed to do for an army is be its eyes and ears and provide information. Well, that information has been spotty at best, because you've got guys like John Wharton, who's stationed in the area around here, around Nolensville and Triune, who is providing a screen with his cavalry to keep the enemy's eyes away from what's going on down here at Nolensville and to the south down to Triune. That Rosecrans has some inklings about where the Confederates might be, but he really doesn't know exactly where they are. So what Rosecrans decides to do on December 26, 1862, since his army is divided into 3 wings or corps, is he will do just what you see on the map here. He will basically send those 3 corps on different routes out of Nashville, sort of like playing a game of blind man's bluff. He's just going to do this and hope that when his hand touches the enemy, he doesn't touch the whole darn thing and get it cut off. Okay? So, Crittenden's left wing will advance down the Nashville Pike. And tomorrow's program over at the Jefferson Pike Bridge will be about their advance down along the only really paved, it's macadamized road, the Nashville Pike. So they're able to make pretty good time going down that way. They'll be facing Joe Wheeler and his cavalry brigade. Wheeler is also, besides functioning as a brigade commander in the Army, is also the chief of cavalry now. So he has to command all of the Confederate cavalry while also functioning as a combat commander in the field. This is not necessarily a good idea. McCook's right wing of the Union Army will advance down the Nolensville Pike and head for Nolensville. They've gotten reports that Hardee's entire corps, half of the Confederate Army, is down at Triune. So his job is to determine if indeed they are. And if they are, he is to attack them and destroy them. If they are not, he will begin moving towards Murfreesboro, where there's lots of reports of a major concentration of Confederates, and try to join up with Crittenden there. George Thomas will head down even farther to the west of McCook, down towards Franklin. He'll have cavalry out in front of him. The idea is to check and make sure. There are also reports of Confederates in Franklin. In fact, there are about 50 or 60 cavalrymen are in Franklin, part of Wharton's brigade, that is spread out. He may be centered here in Nolensville, but his cavalry units are spread out as well from this central point to cover a long line to try to keep the enemy at bay and keep them from seeing what's going on. If it's determined that there isn't much of a force in Franklin, then Thomas will turn, like you see on the map, come towards Nolensville, and then continue on through this intersection towards the Nashville Pike, where he will get in behind Crittenden, and eventually you can kind of see how these arrows all begin to concentrate towards Murfreesboro. Rosecrans figures that probably Murfreesboro is where this fight's going to be, or maybe even a little bit before it at Stewart's Creek. So he's making a plan to kind of search things out, get better information, and then ultimately unite his forces, but also at the same time trying to keep them within supporting distance of one another, so if he is engaged in this game of blind man's bluff, and he does happen to touch a much larger force than he thought he was going to get, the other guys can rush to that before it turns into a disaster for him. This is a very dangerous and fluid situation. Now, as McCook starts heading down this road, it's too bad we weren't doing this yesterday, because then I could give you the perfect weather. Y'all remember what you woke up to Christmas morning? Those gully washers of rain? You read the accounts, and there aren't a whole lot of soldiers' accounts about what happened here in Nolensville, but there are a few. The universal constant is that it rained like heck, and in torrents. So that heavy downpour rain that we had yesterday morning through most of this area was the kind of weather that those boys were marching out in. Colder, though, by the way, by almost 20 degrees than what we had yesterday as they started marching down the Nolensville Pike. In fact, Private Charles Cunningham of the 5th Wisconsin Artillery, which is part of the force that would be engaged here at the battle at Nolensville, said, "We broke camp and marched towards Nolensville through a heavy rainstorm. The wheels of the artillery were one mass of mud." Our soil down here has that kind of clay stuff in it, and as those wheels were rolling and sinking into the mud and churning it up, it was actually filling in the gaps between the spokes on the wheels, so they were just one solid thing of kind of a red, mucky mess. Now imagine your soldiers marching behind that as you're coming in. In fact, what McCook realizes is that as the front end of his column begins to bog down, he decides that he's going to try to send part of his force down another road, which is not well known or mapped, the Edmondson Pike, but he kind of knows it's there. He's going to send Jefferson Davis's division down that road to swing to the west of Nolensville, turning and coming in kind of around where that road comes in there right now, in from the west side of Nolensville. So essentially he's created a kind of a pincer move. And if we're standing here, and as soon as they get within sight of the town of Nolensville, Wharton has his cavalrymen spaced out about 10, 15, 20 paces apart from one another. Their job, again, is to just kind of start shooting at the enemy as they come forward. The Union, Davis will throw out the 59th Illinois Infantry as skirmishers in front of Colonel Sidney Post's brigade. They're the ones in the lead coming in from the west here. And when those boys come out into line, now who commands a regiment, by the way? Who knows? What's the rank of somebody who commands a regiment generally?
Colonel.
Colonel, right. And if he's hurt, then there's the lieutenant colonel. And if he's not around, there's a major, right? 59th Illinois is commanded by a captain. David Lathrop of the 59th Illinois explains how that happened. He says, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick started out with the regiment, but having poor health soon fell back to an ambulance and returned to Nashville. Major Winters was at home, and Captain Hale, the senior captain, was absent also. The command therefore fell to Captain Payne, who was a strict disciplinarian. In fact, he had procured for himself the nickname of Buck and Gag. I've looked at, there's some, books that have been out, kind of written by soldiers about the Civil War. One of the great ones is The Hardtack and Coffee, and it's got little drawings of stuff, and there's a chapter on crime and punishment.
What is buck and gag?
Buck and gag is basically tying your hands behind your back, tying your legs together, so you have to sort of sit on your knees, and then you put a piece of wood through the mouth and tie it down to where the hands are tied. Not a pretty picture. This guy was a pretty strict disciplinarian, so when he gave the command to go forward, guess what the 59th Illinois did? They went forward. Nobody's messing with old Buck and Gag. I mean, he's going to go for it. And the 59th would begin pushing in from the west down along the road here towards town. As they begin to make contact with the enemy and Wharton's cavalry starts to put up a fight, as they get closer to where we're standing right now, the Confederates have White's Tennessee battery assigned to Wharton's brigade, and two of White's guns will post up. Where do you think they would post from up around here?
High ground.
Right up on this high ground right up here, and start firing down the road at the enemy as they're coming up from Trim's blacksmith station up along the road. And that kind of staggers them for a bit. Alright, so, and now you get a better shot of the intersection here in the road coming up this way, that is part of the historic road that kind of ran through this intersection down towards Stewartsboro in that direction, and then if we pick up the Nolensville Pike to the right where you see the flag is over there, that heads us down towards Triune. So the 59th Illinois is coming in as skirmishers, and they hit that first thing and they get staggered. Now when your skirmishers get slowed up, the rest of the brigade will come up, the rest of the Post Brigade. And Colonel Post, by the way, commanding the brigade, is the colonel of the 59th Illinois. That's why he's not around just commanding the brigade. The 59th will pull back into what we normally think of as Civil War soldiers, shoulder to shoulder, 2 ranks deep. And they will dress with their lines so that their left is touching the road. So they'll be on the right side of the road coming in. An Indiana regiment will come up next to them, the 28th Indiana, and dress themselves on the left. And the rest of the brigade will follow, and the rest of Jefferson Davis's division will begin getting on track and moving forward. Now that takes a little time. And that, in fact, is all that John Wharton, commanding the cavalry unit here in this area. He altogether has about 2,000 effective soldiers in his brigade. But don't for a second think that all 2,000 of them are fighting here. Because what did I say about 50, 60 of them were? All the way down in Franklin. And there are patrols of those men stretched out between Franklin and here. Many of those guys, well, they have assignments, so they can't just up in the saddle and run over here. They still got to guard all the roads and bridges and things that they're watching, because their orders are, You know, those of you that rode out with me, how many bridges over streams did we cross coming through here? And what's the best way to slow down an enemy that is greater in number than you that has to cross a bunch of streams on the roads? Take out the bridges. So what are those Confederate soldiers? They're there to watch and keep away, but if they can't, what else do they have in their back pocket? Torches. To burn those bridges down so that they can slow the enemy down. So they can't just leave. So I figure out of his 2,000 or so effective soldiers, Wharton maybe at best has about 1,000 close enough to Nolensville to put up this fight. He's going to be facing, all told, in Jefferson C. Davis's division, 4,644 men. Just in Post Brigade, which takes on the bulk of the fighting here at the Battle of Nolensville, there are more than 1,400 soldiers, not counting the artillery. So there is a distinct numerical advantage here. And as those guys begin to form up and start moving forward, it took them about 10 minutes or so to put that together. That's 10 precious minutes that John Wharton has had to send messengers pounding down the Nolensville pike towards Triune to let the remaining soldiers, not Hardee himself, General Hardee has actually begun already moving most of his corps back towards the Murfreesboro area, but he has left behind elements of Patrick Claiborne's division and some of its artillery. So he's going to let them know that he's in the fight. Not that they didn't already know, because they can hear the gunshots and the cannons begin to boom and they know something's going on. Trouble is, that happens a lot around here. During the early December, mid-November, there's all kinds of little tit-for-tatting, poking here and there. So there's almost always gunfire coming from somewhere. So how do they know that this is a really big deal? That this is more than just a raid or a foraging train? He's going to let those messengers go. He's going to begin sending them over to find Joe Wheeler, let him know he's being attacked on the left. Of course, Wheeler already knows something is up because he's being pushed down the Nashville pike by Crittenden's left wing. And then those messengers will also get back to General Braxton Bragg, who now begins to realize that it seems like the Union Army has in fact bestirred itself the day after Christmas 1862 and is on its way. A few of the Confederate cavalrymen took shelter in a home. I don't think it still stands today, but because we've never been really able to truly determine what it is, but it could be one of the historic homes that is still around. If you find one with a couple cannonballs holes through it, it may be it. Because they started using that as a place from which to fire from. And David Lathrop of the 59th wrote this about what happened as they started taking that fire. They rolled up the guns of the 5th Wisconsin Light Artillery and they began to fire on the house. And he said the first shell exploded in one of the upper rooms, doing wonderful execution among the furniture and tearing the plastering and casing into 1,000 fragments. This brought the Rebs to light, and a volley from the company sent them howling into the woods. The second shell passed through the hen house, scattering chickens and feathers in all directions. Nolensville, wasn't a particularly big town when the war broke out. And I expect because of its location close to Nashville, it may be very similar to what happened in the town of Laverne. Now, those of us that live around here know the town of Laverne is on its way to becoming a city. In fact, there's as many people living there right now that was in the entire Union Army. And it's got one of the biggest subdivisions in the United States of America. But Laverne, when the Union Army passed through it on December 27th, 1862, had 6 families still living in the town. Most of the other homes were either abandoned or had been damaged or destroyed. Why? Because Laverne is so darn close to Nashville, all that little tit-for-tatting that was going on, it was happening in those people's front yards every other day. And they either just, were blown out of their houses or literally just said, the heck with it, we're leaving. Well, Nolensville was probably in a very similar situation. A lot of the homes here in Nolensville may or may not have been occupied at that point, because this is not the only fight it's one of the biggest fights that occurs in Nolensville, but it is by far not the only fight that happens here. So the town was probably even smaller than one would have imagined if you had seen it, say, in 1859, because a lot of folks just said, you know what, we're getting out of the way. Because all we are now is sitting right between the Confederate and the Union lines, and all that back and forthing is just tearing us apart. It's like being under a whipsaw. As one Murfreesboro citizen said about their town when the lines shift down there after the Battle of Stones River. They get kind of the same sort of feeling as well. So, with a few shots fired from the Union artillery, doing that work on the house and actually driving back mainly the Confederate artillery forces, the Confederates will pull up stakes and begin heading back down the road. So what I want to do is just take a little walk and keep on going this way. I want to kind of get to the crest of that hill so we can sort of see the intersection down there, because that's going to be important to us, okay? Does anybody have any questions? So by about 2 p.m., the Confederates have pretty much given up their resistance here in Nolensville. And Wharton has his men in the saddle, and they're riding in the direction that pickup truck is heading right down the Nolensville Pike, about a mile or two down the road. In fact, when you're heading out of here, you can kind of see off in the distance, you can see those rolling hills in the distance over there. And they keep kind of, there's an area between here and Triune that kind of has some rolling, folding hills, and the road actually passes through a gap between two of those hills. It's locally known as Knob Gap. That's where Wharton is going to set up his next defensive position. Because again, what Wharton is trying to do here, he can't win this fight. There's no way with a bunch of dismounted cavalrymen, keeping in mind, we already said probably only has about half of his men at his disposal, so about 1,000. He'll take about 20 or so casualties here in Nolensville. About 20 or so. I mean, this is not the Battle of Stones River by any stretch of the imagination. But if you happen to be one of those 20, it sure feels like it, I guarantee you. But with all those troopers, since they have their horses, every time they dismount to fight, you also have to subtract 1/4 of that manpower. Because the cavalry functions in groups of 4. And when you dismount to fight, 1 man in 4 stays on his horse and holds the rein to the other 3 guys who are down on the ground. He can't shoot. His job is to keep the horses away from the firing enough so they don't get shot, but also close enough that the guys have to get up and get out of dodge really fast, that the horses are there not running all over the place. Because these are pretty well-trained horses. They're pretty used to being, having gunfire around them and stuff like that. But left to their own devices without a rider on them, what is the horse going to do when things start to go boom? It's going to run away. So you literally have 1 guy in 4 sitting on his horse trying to hold 3 others. There ain't no way he's going to shoot anything. So in fact, what Wharton is boiled down to is probably only about 750 men to conduct his fight. He wants to just slow them down. It took Post and his men about 10 minutes or so to kind of get their men on track, reform the 59th Illinois, bring the rest of the brigade up in position before they start to advance forward. You give them a few more shots, then you run away to Knob Gap. Once they reach Nolensville, the army will pause for a moment because, once you've been in a fight, things start to get a little disorganized and you have to kind of put them back together. And what I think he was actually hoping is the Union Army would sort of pause here and they could fight again the next day at Knob Gap. But Jeff Davis has got his ire up. Even though he looks down the road and he can see from the intersection, if you're heading back to Murfreesboro, you want to kind of follow the route of McCook's Corps, just go down this road until you hit Route 96 and hang a left. That's the Franklin Pike, and you can follow them right back into Murfreesboro. As you're driving down this road, though, it's incredible. Those hills will start to rise up behind you. The road will wind in between those hills through that gap. And that's where Wharton's got troopers on either side. He's got two guns from White's Tennessee Battery, plus 2 guns from the Georgia Battery that has been sent up with a brigade of infantry from Claiborne's division. So he's got infantrymen on that hill, too. So now he's approaching somewhere around 1,500 men on the hills plus 4 cannons. The enemy has to go through that deadly notch. So what Davis does is he actually saves the army a lot of time, because if they had just stopped here and then started moving in column down that road, they would have had to then stop, deploy their men out in the fields, and then move forward, which would have taken 20, 30, 40 minutes before they could even do that under fire. But Davis, decides even though the light is failing, he's still got a chance to dislodge the enemy from that strong position. So he takes Post's brigade and William Carlin's brigade of his division, followed by Woodruff's brigade, and he begins pushing them forward just pell-mell across these fields. This is not what I would call an organized attack. We say Davis's division advanced forward, but from all the accounts of the reports, even Davis himself says that each division, each brigade, basically was fighting on its own hook. Post would be on the left. He would attack the position that actually had the cannons on it on the left side of the road. Carlin would be attacking on the right, a much higher hill, but with no artillery on it to support the men up there. Woodruff would eventually swing over to the right on his own and go through an area where there were only a few cavalrymen sitting behind trees firing their muskets and shotguns, and would bowl right through that. Oscar Pinney would bring up his 5th Wisconsin artillery of 6 guns, and the other 2 batteries of the division would come up as well. So by the time you get to about 3:30, you have 4 Confederate cannons facing off against 18 Union guns. And some of those Union guns are rifles. When you go out on the battlefield, you'll see some of the guns look green. Those are bronze guns. Many of those are smoothbores. They fire a round cannonball that at best can go about a mile, sometimes less than that. And your accuracy, not so good. The black guns you see out on the battlefield are made of iron. Those are rifled cannons. They have spiral lands and grooves cut in. They shoot a bullet-shaped projectile that comes out spinning. It's like the difference between throwing a basketball and a football. Which one can you throw farther and more accurately?
Football.
Because the football is doing what?
Spinning.
Spinning. Come on, y'all watched Peyton Manning before. I know that.
Yeah.
Okay. In the day. Maybe not so much this year. But, he could throw a ball 70 yards and hit a guy running. Okay? Well, when those rifles start to unlimber and fire against the Confederate smoothbore guns, if they're firing from your position here, they can fire down the road and it lands right about here. That's about a mile. I could shoot my rifle from here. Ain't nothing you can do. It ain't fair at all. I know it ain't. And so, before the sun goes down on December 26, 1862, despite the fact that the Confederates had this very good, strong position, the Union artillery starts to rock their world. Then when Woodruff starts skidding around the right side, and actually, if he realizes it, he doesn't actually, but if he realizes that he can actually swing like a door around them and cut them off from Triune, that could be it. Luckily, John Wharton, who knows his business, he's one of the best cavalry commanders in the Confederate Army, bar none. He doesn't get enough credit at all here in the Western Theater because, frankly, his name is overshadowed by 3 bigger names, Morgan, Forrest, and Wheeler. But Wharton, if you look at some of these guys and what they do as cavalrymen, one of the constants you can find a lot of times in some of their great successes is John Wharton commanding either his 8th Texas Cavalry or later as a general commanding a cavalry brigade. He is just that good. He sees what's going on, withdraws his men from the hills, leaving the artillery to keep on firing just a little bit longer to keep them at bay. In fact, a little bit too long, because one of the guns from King's Georgia Battery will be captured by the Union forces as they go up the hill, and heads back to Triune. He's done his best. By the time he reaches Triune, most of the Confederate infantry, artillery, wagons, things like that are already on the road heading back towards Murfreesboro. So he's done his job. He's shielded Triune long enough for the remainder of the Confederate forces to get out of there. He's delayed the Union Army, what should have taken them without resistance. They should have been able to march from Nashville clear to Triune in one day. They've only made it about 2/3 of the way. A big part of that is because the cavalry put up such a good stiff resistance. When the Union Army starts, Colonel Post says of this, he said, "This march had been made in a drenching rain, and the men, exhausted by their exertions upon the muddy road, and the excitements of the day bivouacked on the field for the possession of which they had fought. So the Union Army will pretty much bed down. Davis's division is occupying Nobbs Gap. The other two divisions of McCook's right wing have moved into the Nolensville area, and they're sitting here ready to go. Now Davis's men will be relieved that night, and Johnson's division and Sheridan's divisions will move forward, and Davis will move back. I mean, he's been in the fight now. The other guys haven't. All they've been doing is sashaying up the road, albeit through mud that, as one soldier said, actually was sucking the shoes right off of the men because they were sinking down deeper than their knees as they were moving across these fields. And they were prepared to move forward on the march. Well, you think that's bad? You should read things. Remember I was showing you on the map our boy Thomas going down to Franklin and then coming over to Nolensville? Well, by the night of December 26th, Thomas is supposed to have gone all the way down through Brentwood, picked up the road to Nolensville, and be here that night. Because of the awful condition of the roads, there is no Confederate cavalry in his front whatsoever. Just because of the awful conditions of the road, Thomas has actually only just gotten past Brentwood. He rushes one of his divisions, Negley's division. They march all night long. By midnight, December 27, 1862, Negley's men will finally arrive here in Nolensville, but the rest of Thomas's corps, some of them have not even left Nashville yet. Jeez. So he's way behind schedule. If you're going to continue on with me on these programs, that's going to become a bigger and bigger worry during this campaign as Thomas falls farther and farther behind. And that's going to affect what happens on 27th, 28th, and 29th, and so forth. Because again, one of Rosecrans's big things is to try to keep all three separate units of his army as together, close enough to each other to support each other. Once he does find the main enemies, the main force of the enemy, not get caught with part of his army fighting the entire. So that's becoming a big, big worry. Just to finish up the 26th, Crittenden is doing just fine. He's got a paved road. He's moved all the way down from Nashville, sees the bridges across Hurricane Creek, and has basically got his army poised just on the outskirts of the tiny town of Laverne, and plans to begin moving forward through it to move to the next major impediment, the one that General Rosecrans is most worried about, which is Stewart's Creek. Stewart's Creek is in fact a creek. It's not a navigable river, but it's